My wife was supposed to be getting massages and drinking green smoothies at some exclusive wellness retreat when Riverside General Hospital called to tell me she'd been in a serious car accident. The voice on the other end was professional but urgent, explaining that Penelope had sustained significant injuries and I needed to come immediately as her emergency contact. I was in my home office on that Saturday afternoon, reviewing quarterly financial reports for my consulting firm while enjoying the quiet house and planning to surprise Penelope with her favorite Thai takeout when she returned Sunday evening, when my phone rang with the call that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my marriage. The attending physician, Dr. Martinez, mentioned that another passenger had been in the vehicle, a man named Garrett Sullivan who'd suffered only minor injuries and was being discharged soon with nothing more than some bruising and a mild concussion. I remember thinking it was strange that Penelope would be carpooling to a spa retreat with someone I'd never heard of, especially since she'd specifically told me she was driving up alone to meet her college roommate Tessa for their Plan Girls weekend of wellness and reconnection. My immediate concern was getting to the hospital to see how badly she was hurt, but something about the entire situation felt off in a way I couldn't quite identify, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit together properly. Penelope had left Friday morning with her designer overnight bag, her yoga mat, and that expensive skincare kit she'd bought specifically for what she enthusiastically called her much-needed rejuvenation weekend. She'd been excited about this getaway with Tessa at some upscale facility in the mountains that specialized in detox treatments, guided meditation sessions, and spiritual renewal practices designed for busy professional women. For weeks, she'd been talking about how desperately she needed this time away to reconnect with herself and reset her mental energy after what she described as an incredibly stressful period at her marketing job, where she'd been working late nights and dealing with demanding clients. I'd not only encouraged her to go but had also given her extra spending money for premium spa treatments and organic meals, thinking it would be wonderful for her to have some quality time with an old friend and return home feeling refreshed, centered, and ready to tackle whatever challenges awaited her at work. The retreat was supposed to be one of those exclusive places where they confiscate your phone upon arrival and you spend the entire weekend in complete digital detox, focusing on mindfulness and personal growth, which perfectly explained why I hadn't heard from her since her brief text Friday evening saying she'd arrived safely and would see me Sunday night. As I drove toward the hospital through Saturday afternoon traffic, navigating familiar streets while my mind raced with worry about Penelope's condition and what kind of injuries she might have sustained, I realized I should probably call Tessa to coordinate our visiting schedules and find out if she'd also been hurt in whatever accident had occurred during their weekend together. I found Tessa's number stored in Penelope's phone contacts and dialed while sitting at a red light, expecting to reach someone equally frantic about our shared crisis and possibly dealing with her own medical situation after what sounded like a serious collision. Instead, Tessa answered cheerfully from what sounded like a bustling restaurant or sidewalk cafe, with unfamiliar Spanish-speaking voices and what I immediately recognized as flamenco music playing in the background, creating an atmosphere that was completely incompatible with being at a hospital or dealing with any kind of emergency. When I explained about Penelope's accident and asked which hospital they'd taken her to so we could coordinate our visits and support each other through this crisis, Tessa went completely silent for what felt like an eternity, as if my words had genuinely shocked her. Then she told me something that made my blood run cold and forced me to pull over to the side of the road to avoid causing my own accident. She'd been in Barcelona for the past 2 weeks on an extended work assignment for her architecture firm and had absolutely no idea what spa weekend I was talking about, nor had she made any such plans with Penelope. She hadn't even spoken to Penelope in over 6 months, not since a brief holiday conversation last December, and they'd certainly never discussed any wellness retreat or weekend getaway together. I sat there in my car as Saturday traffic continued moving around me, trying to process what I just learned while my phone's GPS continued displaying the hospital's address and estimated arrival time. The woman I'd been married to for 6 years, the person I trusted completely and shared every significant decision with, had constructed an elaborate and detailed lie about her entire weekend plans, involving not just a fake destination but also using her old college friend as fictional cover for whatever she'd actually been doing with this mysterious Garrett Sullivan whose name had never been mentioned once in our entire relationship. My hands were no longer shaking from worry about Penelope's potential injuries, They were shaking from the devastating realization that the person lying in that hospital bed had been living a completely different life than the one I thought we shared, complete with secret relationships and carefully planned deceptions. I found myself sitting there wondering how many other weekends, business trips, late nights at the office, or supposed girls' nights out had involved similar elaborate lies, and whether anything about our 6-year marriage had been genuine or just another carefully constructed performance designed to maintain her cover story. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was rushing to comfort and support someone who'd been actively deceiving and betraying me, but I knew I needed to see this situation through and understand exactly what I was dealing with before making any life-altering decisions about our future together. As I finally pulled into the hospital parking garage and found a space near the emergency entrance, I realized this weekend was going to fundamentally change everything about my life, regardless of how serious Penelope's injuries turned out to be or what explanations she might try to offer about her relationship with Garrett Sullivan and the elaborate web of lies she'd constructed. Instead of walking through those hospital doors to comfort my injured wife, I made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable just hours earlier. I drove straight to the Impound facility where they'd towed our destroyed SUV. Something about this entire situation demanded investigation rather than blind sympathy, and I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with before facing Penelope and whatever explanations she might try to fabricate about her secret weekend with Garrett Sullivan. My analytical nature, the same methodical approach that had made me successful in consulting, was now focused on uncovering the truth about my own marriage rather than solving client problems. The Impound lot was exactly what you'd expect from a government facility: chain-link fences topped with razor wire, board attendants smoking cigarettes, and endless rows of damaged vehicles telling silent stories about moments when lives changed forever in split seconds. I showed my registration and insurance cards to a clerk who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on a Saturday afternoon, explained that my wife had been in a serious accident, and requested access to examine our vehicle for personal belongings that might need to be recovered before the insurance company inevitably declared it a total loss. The clerk barely glanced at my paperwork before handing me a clipboard with liability forms and directing me toward the back section where the more seriously damaged vehicles were stored, warning me that I had exactly 30 minutes before they locked the gates for the weekend and wouldn't reopen until Monday morning. Our black SUV was barely recognizable as the vehicle Penelope had driven away in just yesterday morning, looking more like abstract metal sculpture than anything that had once transported us safely through 6 years of marriage. The entire passenger side was crumpled like an accordion, surrounded by scattered safety glass and twisted metal that spoke to the violence of whatever collision had occurred during their romantic weekend getaway. I approached the wreckage carefully, noting that the passenger side had taken the worst of the impact, which explained why Garrett had escaped with only minor injuries while Penelope faced a much more serious medical situation requiring extended hospitalization. The driver's side door hung at an odd angle, partially detached from its hinges, but I managed to force it open enough to access the interior, where Penelope's personal belongings were scattered across the seats and floor like evidence waiting to be cataloged and analyzed. Among the expected items, her designer purse with its contents spilled across the dashboard, expensive sunglasses she'd bought for this trip, and the remains of what had once been a premium coffee cup from some boutique cafe. I found things that made my stomach drop and confirmed my worst suspicions about the true nature of her carefully planned weekend deception. Tucked behind the passenger seat, carefully hidden from casual observation, were several shopping bags from an upscale lingerie boutique downtown, containing items I'd never seen before in our entire marriage. Silk pieces in deep burgundy and black colors she never wore for me, along with designer swimwear with the tags still attached showing prices that made me wince, and an assortment of massage oils and scented candles from some exclusive spa that certainly wasn't the wellness retreat she'd so enthusiastically described. These weren't purchases made for a girl's weekend of meditation, yoga, and detoxification. They were the carefully selected accessories for a romantic getaway with someone she was desperately trying to impress, someone who apparently warranted the kind of effort and expense she'd stopped putting into our relationship years ago. The items told a story of premeditation and excitement that felt like a knife in my chest, evidence that she'd been planning and anticipating this weekend with the same enthusiasm she'd once shown for our anniversaries and special occasions. But the discovery that made my hands shake with genuine rage and forced me to sit down heavily on the impound lot's concrete curb was wedged between the back seats where someone had tried to secure it properly, our infant goddaughter's car seat, still strapped in place exactly where we'd carefully installed it 3 weeks earlier when we'd volunteered to babysit for my business partner and his wife during their anniversary dinner. The seat was twisted and damaged from the impact, its bright purple padding torn and stained with something I didn't want to identify, and I realized with crystal clarity that if we'd been babysitting this weekend as originally planned, Penelope would have driven to her secret rendezvous with a 6-month-old baby secured in that very seat, putting an innocent child at risk for the sake of her selfish desires and romantic plans with Garrett Sullivan. I sat there in that grim impound lot, surrounded by the wreckage of what had once been our shared vehicle and our shared life, staring at evidence that the woman I'd married was capable of deceptions and risk-taking that went far beyond simple adultery into territory that challenged everything I thought I knew about basic human decency. The massage oils and lingerie painted a clear picture of careful premeditation. This wasn't some spontaneous mistake or moment of weakness brought on by opportunity and poor judgment, but a meticulously planned romantic weekend that she'd been looking forward to and preparing for while lying directly to my face every single day for weeks. The presence of that damaged car seat revealed something even more disturbing about her fundamental character, a willingness to potentially endanger others, including helpless children who depended on adult protection, rather than alter her plans or face the inconvenience of rescheduling her affair to a more appropriate time. I photographed everything with my phone, methodically documenting not just the evidence of her lies and betrayal but also that twisted car seat that represented how little she actually cared about anyone's safety or well-being when it conflicted with her personal desires and romantic fantasies. As I walked back through the impound lot toward my own car, passing dozens of other damaged vehicles and their own tragic stories, I realized I wasn't just looking at the aftermath of a traffic accident. I was examining the physical evidence of a person I'd never really known, someone capable of elaborate deceptions and shocking disregard for others that went to the very core of who she was as a human being. The woman lying in that hospital bed with her injuries and her sob story wasn't the person I'd fallen in love with and married 6 years ago. She was someone who'd been wearing a carefully constructed mask throughout our entire relationship, and this accident had finally torn it away to reveal the calculating stranger who'd been living in my house and sharing my bed while planning her escape into someone else's arms. By Sunday evening, both families had mobilized into full crisis intervention mode, with Penelope's twin sister Margot leading the charge and my own mother serving as her reluctant ally in what they clearly viewed as my unreasonable and heartless abandonment of my injured wife. I'd spent the day at home, methodically organizing the photographs I'd taken at the impound lot and researching divorce attorneys online, when the coordinated family assault began with a phone call from Margot that quickly escalated into a 3-way conference call including my mother. Margot's voice was sharp with accusation as she explained that Penelope had been asking for me constantly since regaining consciousness, wondering why her husband hadn't come to visit or even called to check on her condition after such a traumatic accident. According to Margot, Penelope was devastated by my apparent abandonment and couldn't understand why I was being so cruel during her most vulnerable moment, especially when she needed my support and comfort more than ever. My mother, clearly uncomfortable but feeling obligated to support family unity, gently suggested that perhaps I was in shock myself and needed to remember that marriage vows included standing by each other through sickness and health, for better or worse. She reminded me that Penelope had always been a loving wife who'd made mistakes like everyone else, and that holding grudges during a medical crisis wasn't the Christian thing to do. I listened patiently to their coordinated presentation, recognizing the careful way they'd planned this intervention to maximize emotional pressure while minimizing my opportunity to explain the actual situation they were asking me to overlook. When they finished their prepared remarks about forgiveness, compassion, and marital duty, I calmly explained exactly what I discovered about Penelope's elaborate deception, the romantic purchases hidden in our destroyed vehicle, and the presence of our goddaughter's damaged car seat that revealed her willingness to endanger innocent children for her personal gratification. The silence that followed my methodical recounting of evidence was profound enough that I actually checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped, before Margot finally spoke in a much smaller voice to ask whether I was absolutely certain about what I'd found. I described the lingerie in colors Penelope never wore for me, the massage oils from spas that had nothing to do with wellness retreats, and the swimwear with tags still attached showing she'd been shopping specifically for this romantic weekend while lying to my face about girls' trips and digital detoxes. But it was the car seat that really drove the point home, the twisted, damaged seat that represented how little she cared about anyone's safety when it conflicted with her desires, and how she'd been willing to risk a 6-month-old baby's life rather than reschedule her affair to a more convenient time. My mother's voice was barely a whisper when she asked how long I thought this had been going on, and I explained that the premeditation involved suggested this wasn't some impulsive mistake but rather a carefully planned betrayal that had required weeks of preparation and deliberate deception. Margot tried one last appeal to family loyalty, suggesting that people sometimes made terrible decisions when they felt trapped or unappreciated, but I interrupted her to explain that this wasn't about feeling unappreciated. This was about fundamental character and the kind of person who could construct elaborate lies while endangering others for personal pleasure. I told them both that the woman I'd married 6 years ago would never have been capable of such calculating selfishness, which meant either I'd never really known Penelope at all, or she'd undergone some fundamental transformation that made her unrecognizable as the person I'd chosen to build a life with. The conversation ended with both women accepting, however reluctantly, that this situation went far beyond typical marital problems into territory that challenged the basic foundations of trust and character that any healthy relationship required. When Penelope's father called later that evening, his approach was more direct and frankly more honest than the women's emotional manipulation. He simply asked whether I was planning to divorce his daughter and what that would mean for her financial situation. I respected his straightforward approach and explained that I was consulting with attorneys about my options, but that my decision had already been made based on discoveries that revealed fundamental character flaws rather than simple mistakes in judgment. He listened without interrupting as I described the evidence I'd documented, and when I finished, he surprised me by saying he'd always suspected Penelope had inherited her grandmother's talent for elaborate deceptions and self-justification. He told me he couldn't blame me for protecting myself from someone who'd proven capable of such calculated betrayal, and that he'd make sure Penelope understood that her actions had consequences that extended beyond her own immediate desires. The final family intervention came from my own father, who'd driven over unannounced Monday morning to have what he called a man-to-man conversation about the situation. He sat in my kitchen drinking coffee while I showed him the photographs from the Impound lot, listening carefully as I explained each piece of evidence and what it revealed about the elaborate planning that had gone into Penelope's deception. When I finished my presentation, he nodded slowly and told me he'd seen enough divorces in his lifetime to recognize the difference between marriages that could survive infidelity and relationships that had been fundamentally poisoned by character revelations that made rebuilding trust impossible. He said the car seat was the detail that convinced him I was making the right decision, because anyone willing to endanger a child for personal gratification couldn't be trusted with the kind of vulnerability that marriage required. As he prepared to leave, he told me he was proud of how I was handling an impossible situation with dignity and clear thinking, rather than letting emotion or family pressure drive me into decisions I'd regret for the rest of my life. By the end of that week, both families understood that this marriage was over, not because of wounded pride or temporary anger, but because of fundamental character revelations that made any future together impossible. The systematic erasure of Penelope's existence from our shared home became my primary focus during the week she remained hospitalized recovering from her injuries, and I approached the task with the same methodical precision I brought to complex consulting projects that required complete restructuring from the ground up. I started early Monday morning after my father's visit, beginning with the bedroom where 6 years of accumulated intimacy and shared memories had created a suffocating monument to what I now understood had been an elaborate performance rather than a genuine marriage. Every item of her clothing went into boxes, the business suits she'd worn to create an impression of professionalism while planning affairs, the casual outfits she'd claimed to love but apparently never found exciting enough for romantic weekends, and especially the conservative sleepwear she'd worn for me while purchasing silk lingerie for someone else. I folded each piece carefully, not out of respect for her belongings but because maintaining control and dignity throughout this process mattered more than expressing anger through petty destruction of property that legally belonged to both of us. Her jewelry box yielded particularly painful discoveries as I removed each piece and remembered the occasions when I'd given them to her: anniversary gifts, birthday presents, Christmas surprises that I'd thought meant something but now seemed like payments for a performance that had never been real. The perfume bottles on her dresser were next, expensive fragrances she'd claimed to love but apparently saved for special occasions that didn't include time with her husband. I wrapped each bottle carefully in tissue paper before placing them in boxes, noting with bitter irony that I'd never smelled these particular scents on her during our intimate moments together. Her personal photographs were perhaps the most difficult items to pack, because they documented a version of our relationship that I'd believed was genuine but now recognized as carefully curated evidence of a life she'd been living for public consumption rather than personal satisfaction. Pictures of us at company parties where she'd smiled beautifully while probably planning her escape, vacation photos where she'd posed lovingly while mentally comparing me to whatever exciting alternatives she was secretly pursuing, and family gatherings where she'd played the devoted wife while constructing elaborate deceptions about spa weekends and girls' trips. I removed every trace of her artistic endeavors from our walls: watercolor paintings she'd claimed were therapeutic but had probably been covers for time spent with Garrett, ceramic pieces from classes she'd attended while supposedly focusing on personal growth, and inspirational quotes about authenticity and self-discovery that now seemed like cruel jokes about her double life. The books on her nightstand revealed another layer of deception: romantic novels about women finding true love and spiritual guides about living authentically, suggesting she'd been reading about the very things she was actively betraying in our marriage. Her workout equipment and yoga supplies went into boxes along with the meditation cushions and essential oils that were apparently insufficient for finding inner peace within our marriage but perfect for preparing for affairs with more exciting men. I contacted Patricia Wong, an attorney who specialized in high-asset marital dissolutions and had a reputation for protecting clients who needed to move quickly through contentious divorce proceedings without getting trapped in lengthy emotional manipulations disguised as reconciliation attempts. Patricia's office was downtown in one of those sleek buildings that suggested competence and discretion, exactly what I needed for a situation that required legal protection against someone who'd proven capable of elaborate deceptions and character assassination when her plans went awry. During our initial consultation, I presented the evidence I'd documented at the Impound lot, including photographs of the romantic purchases and the damaged car seat that demonstrated Penelope's willingness to endanger others for personal gratification, along with financial records showing unusual credit card activity and text message logs that I'd recovered from our shared phone plan. Patricia reviewed the documentation with the clinical efficiency of someone who'd seen every possible variation of marital betrayal and understood exactly how to build an ironclad case that would protect my assets and reputation from whatever counternarratives Penelope might attempt to construct. She explained that the photographic evidence from the crash scene, combined with the financial records showing purchases she'd hidden from me, would make any claims about my abandoning her during a medical crisis appear exactly as manipulative as they actually were. The legal papers we prepared cited adultery with documented evidence that would make Penelope's case for spousal support nearly impossible to defend, especially given the premeditation demonstrated by her elaborate planning and the character issues revealed by her willingness to potentially endanger a child for personal convenience. Patricia advised me to change all security codes immediately, including the house alarm system, garage door opener, and online banking passwords that Penelope had been using to monitor and potentially manipulate our financial situation while planning her exit strategy. I spent Tuesday evening systematically updating every access code and password we'd shared, effectively cutting off her ability to enter our home or monitor our accounts while she remained hospitalized and presumably planning whatever sob story she intended to use for damage control. The process felt like performing surgery on a relationship that had already died, removing infected tissue to prevent further damage to the healthy parts of my life that could still be salvaged. By Wednesday, I'd contacted a security company to install new locks and a more sophisticated alarm system that would prevent any surprise visits or attempts to retrieve belongings without proper legal supervision. The house felt different with every trace of her presence removed, not empty exactly, but clean in a way I hadn't realized it hadn't been before, as if removing her belongings had also eliminated some invisible contamination that had been poisoning the atmosphere of what should have been our sanctuary. I arranged for a storage unit where her boxed belongings could be kept safely until the divorce proceedings determined how property would be divided, ensuring that I couldn't be accused of destroying or hiding anything that might legally belong to her despite the circumstances of our separation. The final step was having professional cleaners come through to deep clean every surface she'd touched, not because of any hygiene concerns but because I needed to know that every molecule of her presence had been systematically removed from the space where I'd rebuild my life without the contamination of lies and betrayal that had characterized the past 6 years. The 5 months of divorce proceedings that followed became an exhausting marathon of legal maneuvering, with Penelope attempting every possible reconciliation strategy through intermediaries while Patricia methodically dismantled her claims for spousal support and favorable asset division based on the documented evidence of her elaborate deceptions and character defects. Once Penelope was discharged from the hospital and realized the full scope of my response to her betrayal, she immediately launched a campaign of emotional manipulation designed to reframe the narrative from her calculating adultery to my heartless abandonment of an injured wife during her most vulnerable moment. She enlisted Margot as her primary spokesperson, who called me repeatedly with tearful accounts of Penelope's devastation at coming home to an empty house and discovering that I'd removed every trace of our shared life while she was hospitalized and unable to defend herself against what Margot characterized as vindictive cruelty. According to these carefully orchestrated messages, Penelope was willing to end her relationship with Garrett immediately and undergo marriage counseling to rebuild the trust she'd damaged through what she now described as a temporary lapse in judgment caused by feeling unappreciated and emotionally neglected in our marriage. The narrative she constructed through family intermediaries painted her affair as a cry for help rather than deliberate betrayal, suggesting that her elaborate deceptions had been desperate attempts to get my attention and force conversations about problems in our relationship that I'd been too focused on work to notice. She claimed that the romantic purchases I'd discovered were evidence of her attempts to rekindle passion in our marriage, not preparations for an affair, and that Garrett had been nothing more than a friend offering emotional support during a difficult period in her life. When these indirect appeals failed to generate any response from me, Penelope escalated to direct communication through carefully crafted emails that arrived at my office where she knew I couldn't avoid reading them without potentially missing important business correspondence. These messages were masterpieces of emotional manipulation, filled with references to our shared history, promises of change, and increasingly desperate pleas for just one conversation where she could explain her side of the story and demonstrate her commitment to saving our marriage. She wrote about the 6 years we'd built together, the dreams we'd shared, and the future we'd planned, arguing that throwing away everything meaningful in our relationship over one relationship mistake was disproportionate and destructive to both our lives. Her emails gradually became more accusatory, suggesting that my refusal to communicate or consider reconciliation revealed character flaws in me that were just as serious as her infidelity, and that a truly loving husband would have been willing to fight for their marriage instead of abandoning it at the first sign of serious problems. She claimed that my methodical removal of her belongings and systematic erasure of our shared life while she was hospitalized demonstrated a coldness and capacity for emotional cruelty that she'd never suspected existed beneath my caring facade, and that perhaps she'd been justified in seeking emotional connection elsewhere if this was how I treated someone I'd claimed to love when faced with adversity. The legal proceedings themselves became increasingly contentious as Penelope's attorney attempted to argue that the evidence I'd gathered was irrelevant to questions of asset division and spousal support, and that her medical expenses from the accident should be considered in any settlement since the crash had occurred partially due to my emotional neglect creating the circumstances that led to her seeking comfort elsewhere. Patricia demolished these arguments systematically, presenting the photographic evidence from the Impound lot alongside financial records that documented the premeditation involved in Penelope's deceptions, making it clear that this wasn't a spontaneous mistake but a carefully planned betrayal that invalidated any claims to victim status or financial compensation. The car seat evidence proved particularly devastating to Penelope's case, because it demonstrated a level of reckless selfishness that made her claims about being a devoted wife who deserved consideration and support appear ridiculous to anyone examining the facts objectively. When Penelope's attorney attempted to argue that the presence of the car seat was irrelevant to marital misconduct, Patricia pointed out that it revealed fundamental character issues that went far beyond simple adultery into questions about basic moral judgment and regard for others' safety. The judge's questions during hearings made it clear that he found Penelope's willingness to potentially endanger a child for personal convenience particularly troubling, and that her elaborate deceptions demonstrated exactly the kind of calculating dishonesty that justified protective measures for the innocent spouse. As the proceedings dragged on, Penelope's desperation became increasingly apparent through her escalating attempts to contact me directly, including showing up at my office building and my favorite coffee shop in what she probably thought were coincidental encounters but were obviously coordinated attempts to force conversations I'd made clear I didn't want to have. During one particularly uncomfortable encounter in the lobby of my office building, she actually grabbed my arm and started crying loudly about how I was destroying both our lives over a mistake that could be forgiven if I would just remember the good times we'd shared and the love that had once brought us together. I calmly extracted my arm from her grasp and told her that all communication needed to go through our attorneys, while she continued her performance for the benefit of other people in the lobby who were staring at what appeared to be a heartbroken woman being rejected by her cruel husband. The final hearing took place on a cold February morning, with both sides presenting their closing arguments about asset division and spousal support in a courtroom that felt sterile and impersonal compared to the intimate destruction that had brought us there. Patricia's presentation was methodical and devastating, walking through the evidence of premeditation, the character issues revealed by the car seat situation, and the financial documents that showed Penelope had been secretly planning her exit strategy while maintaining the facade of a devoted wife. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive, awarding me the house and the majority of our retirement accounts while limiting Penelope to her personal belongings, her own vehicle once insurance repairs were completed, and a minimal settlement that reflected her shorter contribution to our shared assets and the circumstances of our separation. As we left the courthouse that day, Penelope made one final attempt to engage me in conversation, asking tearfully whether I truly believed that 6 years of marriage meant so little to me that I could walk away without any regret or sadness about what we'd lost together. The reconstruction of my life began immediately after the divorce was finalized, and I approached the process with the same systematic methodology I'd used to remove Penelope's presence from our shared home, but this time focused on building something entirely new rather than simply eliminating contaminated remnants of a failed relationship. The suburban house that had witnessed 6 years of elaborate deceptions and false intimacy felt irreparably tainted despite the professional cleaning and security upgrades, so I listed it with a realtor who specialized in quick sales and began searching for a completely different environment that would support the person I was becoming rather than remind me of who I'd been. Within 3 weeks, I'd accepted an offer from a young couple who saw the house as their dream home and had no idea about the betrayal and heartbreak that had occurred within those carefully decorated walls that Penelope had chosen to create the perfect backdrop for her performance as a devoted wife. I found a sleek downtown loft in a converted warehouse building with exposed brick walls, floor-to-ceiling windows, and an open layout that bore no resemblance to the traditional suburban aesthetic Penelope had preferred when we'd been decorating our supposed forever home together. The loft represented everything she'd never appreciated about urban living: the energy, the convenience, the sense of possibility that came from being surrounded by people who were building interesting lives rather than maintaining carefully curated facades for social media consumption. Moving day felt like shedding an old skin that had become uncomfortable and restrictive, as I systematically replaced every piece of shared furniture with items I'd chosen entirely for my own preferences without considering how they might photograph for anniversary posts or dinner party impressions. The new dining table was sleek and modern where our old one had been traditional and safe. The artwork was abstract and challenging where Penelope had preferred pretty watercolors that matched the couch. And the bedroom was minimalist and masculine where we'd previously maintained the romantic shabby chic aesthetic she'd claimed to love. I enrolled in photography classes that met on Tuesday evenings, something I'd always wanted to explore but had never pursued because Penelope had considered it an expensive hobby that would take time away from home improvement projects and social obligations that served her image management goals. The instructor was a retired National Geographic photographer who taught small groups of adults how to see light and composition in ways that revealed the extraordinary within ordinary moments, and I discovered I had an eye for capturing authentic emotion in unguarded moments. The weekend photography walks through various neighborhoods became my favorite form of meditation, allowing me to explore the city through a lens that focused on genuine beauty rather than manufactured perfection, and I began building a portfolio of images that reflected my own aesthetic sensibilities rather than someone else's vision of what our life should look like. Culinary classes on Thursday nights introduced me to cuisines that Penelope had always dismissed as too adventurous or complicated for her palate, and I learned to prepare complex dishes that challenged my patience and precision while creating flavors that were entirely my own discovery rather than compromises designed to accommodate someone else's limited preferences. I joined a hiking group that met early Saturday mornings for challenging trails outside the city, something Penelope had always refused to do because she claimed outdoor activities were too unpredictable and uncomfortable for her taste, preferring controlled environments where she could maintain her appearance and comfort level. The group included people from various professions who shared a love of physical challenge and natural beauty, and I found myself developing friendships based on shared interests rather than social convenience or professional networking opportunities. My consulting practice flourished during this period of personal reconstruction, as clients responded positively to the confidence and clarity I'd developed through learning to trust my own judgment rather than constantly second-guessing myself based on someone else's reactions and approval-seeking behaviors. I took on more challenging projects that required innovative solutions and creative thinking, abilities that had been suppressed during years of trying to maintain domestic harmony with someone who preferred predictable routines and conventional approaches to every aspect of life. The promotion to senior partner came with a substantial salary increase and the opportunity to mentor younger consultants, responsibilities that allowed me to share the analytical skills and problem-solving techniques I'd developed while navigating my own personal crisis with dignity and strategic thinking. My social circle expanded naturally through these new activities, introducing me to people who valued authenticity and personal growth over image management and social positioning, and I began dating women who were interested in building genuine connections rather than evaluating potential partners based on their ability to fund desired lifestyles. The occasional encounters with Penelope around the city became opportunities to practice the polite indifference I'd cultivated, treating her like any other acquaintance from my past rather than someone who'd once been central to my daily life and future plans. She'd apparently moved into a smaller apartment closer to her sister's place, and based on her appearance during these brief encounters, she was struggling with the financial reality of supporting herself without the supplemental income my career had provided. According to mutual friends who couldn't resist sharing updates, she frequently mentioned feeling lost and regretful about the choices that had led to our divorce, claiming she'd never realized how good our life together had been until she was forced to rebuild everything alone. These reports reached me occasionally through social circles we'd once shared, but they felt like updates about a stranger's struggles rather than information about someone who'd once been central to my daily existence and future planning. 8 months after our divorce was finalized, my mother approached me about having one final conversation with Penelope to achieve what she called complete emotional closure and eliminate any lingering doubts I might have about the decisions that had reshaped both our lives so dramatically. She'd been watching my transformation with approval and pride, noting how much happier and more confident I'd become since removing myself from what she now recognized had been a fundamentally toxic relationship disguised as a loving marriage. However, she worried that I might eventually wonder whether I'd been too hasty or harsh in my judgment, and she thought one honest conversation might provide the definitive closure that would prevent any future regrets or second-guessing about paths not taken. I initially resisted the idea, explaining that I'd already achieved all the closure I needed through my own healing process and the successful reconstruction of my life, but she persisted with her gentle maternal wisdom about the importance of facing difficult truths directly rather than allowing them to fester in the background of an otherwise healthy recovery. She pointed out that Penelope had apparently been telling mutual acquaintances various versions of our story that painted me as vindictive and unforgiving, and that one clear conversation might eliminate her ability to rewrite history in ways that absolved her of responsibility for the destruction of our marriage. After several weeks of consideration, I agreed to meet Penelope for coffee at a neutral location downtown, primarily to demonstrate to myself and anyone else who might be interested that I could face my former wife with complete equanimity and discuss our failed marriage without emotional distress or lingering attachment. The cafe I chose was busy enough to prevent any dramatic scenes but quiet enough for serious conversation, and I arrived early to select a table where I could maintain control of the environment and leave easily if the discussion became manipulative or unproductive. Penelope arrived exactly on time, looking smaller and more fragile than I remembered, wearing conservative clothing that seemed designed to project responsibility and maturity rather than the fashionable image she'd cultivated during our marriage when appearance had been such a crucial component of her self-worth and social positioning. She thanked me for agreeing to meet and immediately launched into what was clearly a prepared speech about her mistakes, her regrets, and her newfound understanding of what she'd lost through her selfish choices and elaborate deceptions that had destroyed the trust and intimacy that had once formed the foundation of our relationship. She spoke about the therapy she'd been attending to understand her motivations for betraying someone who'd loved and supported her, the financial struggles that had forced her to confront the reality of her dependence on my income and stability, and the loneliness that had made her realize how much she'd taken our emotional connection for granted. Her words were carefully chosen and seemed genuine, but I found myself listening with the detached interest I might show to a documentary about someone else's life rather than feeling any emotional resonance with the person who was describing our shared history from her perspective. When she finished her rehearsed apology and explanation, she looked at me expectantly, clearly hoping for some sign that her words had created an opening for reconciliation or at least forgiveness that might restore some version of the relationship she'd discarded so casually when Garrett had seemed like a more exciting option. I took a long moment to consider my response, studying her face and recognizing the desperation behind her composed exterior, before explaining calmly that while I appreciated her willingness to acknowledge her mistakes, the fundamental issue had never been about forgiveness or punishment but about character revelation and the impossibility of rebuilding trust with someone who'd proven capable of such elaborate deception. I told her that discovering the car seat in our wrecked vehicle had been the moment when I realized I couldn't predict what she might be capable of when pursuing her desires, and that this uncertainty about her basic moral judgment had made any future together impossible regardless of her current remorse or promises to change. She began crying then, not the manipulative tears I remembered from our marriage but the genuine grief of someone who finally understood the magnitude of what she'd lost and could never recover through apologies or behavioral modifications. She asked tearfully whether I truly believed she was fundamentally incapable of being trustworthy, and I explained that trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt after such a comprehensive betrayal, especially when that betrayal had revealed a willingness to potentially endanger innocent people for personal gratification. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, with Penelope cycling through various emotional appeals and logical arguments about second chances, personal growth, and the possibility that people could change in meaningful ways when faced with sufficient consequences for their actions. I listened patiently and responded honestly, explaining that while I believed people could certainly change, I wasn't willing to stake my future happiness on the possibility that someone who demonstrated such fundamental character flaws might successfully transform into someone trustworthy and reliable. She finally asked the question that seemed to be driving her desperation for reconciliation, wondering whether there was anything she could do or say that might convince me to consider giving our relationship another chance, perhaps with counseling and careful rebuilding of the trust and intimacy that her betrayal had destroyed. I looked at her directly and told her with complete honesty that there was nothing she could do, because the person I'd fallen in love with and married had never actually existed. She'd been a carefully constructed performance designed to secure the stability and lifestyle she'd wanted, and now that I understood the difference between authentic love and skillful manipulation, I could never again be satisfied with anything less than genuine connection with someone who actually valued what I had to offer. As we prepared to leave the cafe, Penelope made one final attempt to engage my emotions, telling me that she'd never stopped loving me and that destroying our marriage had been the biggest mistake of her life, something she thought about every single day while struggling to rebuild her existence without the partnership and security she'd thrown away for momentary excitement with someone who'd never really cared about her well-being. I told her that I hoped she found genuine happiness and learned from this experience, but that my life had moved beyond our shared past into a future that didn't include her in any meaningful way. Walking back to my car after that conversation, I felt a profound sense of completion and freedom, knowing that I'd faced the most difficult chapter of my life with dignity and emerged stronger, wiser, and more capable of recognizing and appreciating authentic relationships built on mutual respect and genuine compatibility rather than convenience, manipulation, or financial dependency.